This is Naomi Klein. She is the author of 3 books, most recently her international bestseller, The Shock Doctrine. She is a columnist for The Nation and The Guardian, and she blogs for The Huffington Post. In 2004, she co-produced a really terrific film called The Take, about Argentinian factory workers taking over their own factories. And she right now is one of the most influential figures on the left, and she believes in moving the center. She believes it's the job of the left to get out there and say some crazy radical stuff so that when mainstream politicians espouse liberal ideas, they don't look so crazy. So prepare for crazy radical stuff. You were never a starry-eyed Obama fan, so I assume that you haven't been suffering from what you've called a hope hangover. And so given your initial skepticism, do you feel that the first 100 days have gone better or worse than you expected?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Great to be here with you, Larissa. We're the first women on stage. Larissa told me we'd be sitting in chairs like this. So we agreed that there would be no short skirts and that shoes matter. And I just decided to confuse you all, just distract you. By the way, I'm not sure I can live up to the crazy things after Nassim Taleb's presentation. I'm going to seem really moderate, which is weird for me. But yeah, the hope over hope hangover idea, I started writing these little words and canvassing my friends to try to name what I was feeling. It started when Larry Summers was appointed chief economic advisor, and I was trying to name the feeling in myself, and I decided I had a hope lash, a backlash against hope. And this other phrase that I came up with was a hoper coaster, which is like a hope roller coaster, where, and in answer to your question of what the first 100 days have been like, I would say it's been a bit of a hoper coaster in the sense that there have been some wonderful surprises. I was really pleased by Obama's first act in signing the decree to close Guantanamo. I think that there's been some important acts of transparency, like releasing the torture memos. On the other hand, I think we've seen some real setbacks when it comes to accountability for what we're finding out. There's the economic appointments, but more broadly, I think I have been disappointed that there haven't been more appointments that were just really exciting, you know, where you could say, wow, okay, this is somebody who's going to shake things up. I can't think of one person who he's named to a top position where there's been that feeling of, okay, this is really different. Which isn't to say that these are bad people, but I have been disappointed by that. And I think, you know, the stimulus package, you know, I agree with Bob Kuttner that it is too small, as, you know, as odd as that is to say about something so large, but, you know, to meet this moment. But I think the bigger problem with it is that if you're going to take such a big risk and you're going to ask for so much public money, that it should speak to a vision. You know, people should feel that on the other end of this, there's something that is genuinely new and transformative. And I think that, frankly, the critiques that it was piecemeal and all over the place and too compromised were valid critiques, and that really undermines the potential for it, because if people really believe in it and feel like at the end of this, we are going to have a green economy, you know, we're not cutting quarters on public transit, for instance, which the stimulus package does, then I think people would defend it with incredible enthusiasm. So I don't even think it's strategically smart to be moderate with something like that. But, you know, coming back to what you said about moving the center, you know, I feel that the limits of those first 100 days are shared by, there's shared responsibility for those limits. Because what I like about Obama is that he is a mediator, and that's what I mean by, you know, he finds the center. So the role of progressives is to move the center. What I like about Obama is the same thing that worries me about Obama, which is his openness to pressure. And I think if we look at these first 100 days, I think there has been, the biggest failure has been on the part of that incredible grassroots movement that brought him to power, and that he said at every stage, I'm going to need you once I'm in power. And there is such a cult of personality around him and such a superfan culture around him that here we have him facing incredible pressure from the banking association, from the credit card companies, from the market with its demand for consistency and continuity. And for the most part, although there are lots of notable exceptions, what he has gotten from the people who put him in power and mobilized this incredible grassroots campaign and donated to his campaign has been, this, he's our guy. And also a real protectiveness in the face of the virulent right-wing attacks, which is understandable, but I'm not sure is very constructive. Because he is the president of the most powerful nation on earth. And I think a healthy suspicion of that level of power is a good thing.
Yeah. So people need to not go home and get out of campaign mode.
Put away the T-shirts, it's weird. Right. It is weird to wear the T-shirt of the president of the most powerful nation on earth. Like my friend Jeremy Scahill at The Nation, we were talking about why there's so much more mobilization in Europe. You see millions of people on the street in all these countries and a real organization in the face of the bailout. And the slogan that has really taken root in Europe is "We won't pay for your crisis." It started in Italy. The students used that slogan, and it spread to Greece and it spread to France. And my friend Jeremy was saying, I think in Germany they don't wear, Angela Merkel T-shirts. And I think that's
amazing.
Good. I do understand the significance, but still, it's over.
Let's talk about the bank bailout as opposed to the stimulus. You described Paulson's bailout plan as a, quote, robbery in progress, the Bush gang's final frantic looting of the public wealth. And you wrote that it was not, as advertised, an attempt to get credit moving again, but rather to send a plan to send a message that no matter what the banks did, no matter how badly they performed, the government would always bail them out, and therefore shareholders should relax. Do you see any differences in the way that Obama has handled the bank bailout since taking office, and what would you tell him to do differently?
Well, I think that it's a fairly mainstream view now that it wasn't the bailout that was advertised. I mean, we know that the banks have not increased lending. In fact, they've decreased lending, and this was the rationale. This is what Paulson very publicly said, that they shouldn't hoard it. The point was that they were going to lend it. Whether that was the right route to just increase credit is a whole other debate. But it certainly wasn't what was advertised. But I think it's really important in terms of assessing this to remember that it was always a bipartisan bailout. Obama and McCain stopped their campaigns, more or less, came back to Washington and made sure that bailout went through. Obama faced real criticism on the campaign trail. It was really the only issue where his campaign base, got quite angry. I mean, talking to people who worked in his campaign, they were bombarded with calls when he came out in favor of Paulson's bailout. But think about that moment. It was Nancy Pelosi standing next to Bush and Paulson saying, we've got to make this happen. The Congress people who voted against the bailout, this isn't the first time when it failed in Congress. I think the New York Times did a breakdown and found that these were the people in whichever party who were facing the tightest races. So were therefore in a position where they had to listen more closely to voters. So it was always a bipartisan effort. And if we understand that, if we accept that, then the total continuity between the Paulson bailout and the Geithner bailout makes more sense. And of course, Geithner himself is the figure of total continuity in that he was a key figure, sitting at the table. And there was just that extraordinary article in the New York Times where we find out that not only was Timothy Geithner at the table when the Paulson bailout was being discussed, but he was the most radical person at the table and was suggesting that the response to the bailout should be for the government to guarantee all the debt in the banking system. And people thought he was crazy, but that's kind of what's happened through all these piecemeal measures through the FDIC and other measures. So it's been complete continuity, and that hasn't been a secret. And I think the Obama strategy, and I think it's a deeply flawed strategy, has been to believe that you can be Keynesian when it comes to the stimulus package, and a Keynesian light, I would say, because a huge part of the stimulus package is tax cuts. I think there should be a much more real investment in manufacturing, a much more activist approach to job creation and job protection. But that said, Keynesian light in the stimulus, but frankly, crony capitalist in the bailout.
Right.
And if we look at the breakdown of just the numbers at stake, my fear is that one cancels out the other, because the bailout is worth about $11.5 billion. And the stimulus package, in terms of just risk, the amount that the government has put at risk. And then the stimulus package is worth less than $1 trillion. So if the bailout doesn't work, then what we have, and I think this is what I've been saying since the beginning, is that the crisis isn't being resolved. The location is being shifted from Wall Street to Washington. So then you have the crisis on the public books. You have a debt crisis. You don't have enough money. And then that plays out with cutbacks to Social Security, healthcare, food stamps down the road. So that's the real risk. And that's why I say it can cancel out all that sort of Keynesian thinking in the stimulus package.
Right.
So, what should they do? Well, I mean, I think that Sheila Bair was right from the beginning in saying that they should be bailing out homeowners instead of the banks. I agree very much with Robert Kuttner's analysis about how there should be structured failures, that banks should be allowed to fail, they should be broken up, and then there should be regulation put in place to prevent this ever happening again. No bank that is too big to fail is too big to exist. And in fact, we've seen the opposite, where there's been an active encouragement of mergers. So the banks are getting even bigger. And the implication that we will always bail them out is even greater.
Last September, when Paulson was gearing up his first bailout, Naomi was on the television all the time because of the pertinence of the crisis to her most recent book, The Shock Doctrine. The Shock Doctrine, for those of you who haven't read it yet, describes the way that various governments around the world have taken advantage of crises, be they political crises, coups, financial crises, or climactic crises like the tsunami in Sri Lanka, to push through radical free market reforms, very radical deregulation. And in reacting to the present crisis, it looks like the Obama administration, and indeed the Bush administration, is doing the opposite, which is spending massive amounts of government money and pushing for stricter regulations. And so I wondered if you considered this an encouraging counterexample to your thesis, or a new version of the same thing?
Well, I mean, the point of the argument I make in the book is that crises are used to push through very unpopular policies, that often policies that are exactly the opposite of the policies that people have voted for. Because you can use a crisis to concentrate power, say it's an emergency, we have to do this, we have to ram this through. We have a very unique situation that is really unlike anything I talk about in the book, in the sense that this crisis is widely understood to have been created by the very ideology of deregulation and trickle-down economics. And it was Obama himself that put that ideology on trial during the campaign. And in fact, that was the turning point. When he started winning, actually, was after Lehman collapsed, and he had this problem connecting with working class voters who were starting to be attracted to the McCain-Palin ticket. And here we're talking about, I always think it's significant that Sarah Palin came onto the world stage on August 30th. Lehman collapsed on September 14th. So there was a 2-week interval there where Sarah Palin's message of, there's always enough, don't think about tomorrow, drill, baby, drill, come on up to Alaska, that was connecting in a really scary way. And then Lehman collapsed, and Obama started talking about the ideology. And he said it is the ideology of deregulation, giving more and more to people at the top, waiting for it to trickle down, and he just started landing. Plus, it was the maybe not such a great idea to leave the country in the hands of somebody who doesn't read, sort of thing. So, like, we'll just go with the smart guy just this once. But that diagnosis, the only real parallel would be the 1930s, where there was the widespread popular understanding this crisis was created by laissez-faire economics. We're not going to solve it with more of the same. And so you have you have a crisis that is sending us a clear message about the need to fix this system, and you have an extraordinary democratic mandate to do just that. So you don't have a conflict between strong action, strong decisive action, and democracy. In fact, you have a total synergy. And the real failure, I think, is to take advantage of that synergy and deliver on that promise of change. And what I find most scandalous is the fact that we've seen so little re-regulation of the financial sector. FDR used public rage as a resource and channeled it into getting Glass-Steagall passed. And here we're just seeing the rage sort of free-floating and being picked up by the far right, directed at immigrants, directed in really dangerous ways. And we are not seeing a breaking up of the banks. And we're not seeing a use of that leverage. I mean, this idea that first you hand out trillions of dollars, and then once it's already spent, you ask for change. Like, in what negotiation does that work? You know, the International Monetary Fund, you know, country X is broke. They come to Washington and say, we need, you know, $10 billion. And they get a list. They get a structural adjustment program, whatever they call it. They are still doing it. And it's all the things that they have to do to get that money. And here we're supposed to believe that, you know, the real change will come after the money's all spent. And that's what I find really worrying. And I would apply that same problem to the IMF itself, because what we saw at the G20 summit was the only thing that all these countries could agree on was that they would give $1 trillion to the International Monetary Fund, but they didn't structurally adjust the International Monetary Fund at the same time, which is what really needs to happen, and say, okay, you know, you've been advocating more deregulation in the financial sector now for 30 years. You helped create this crisis. How can we be sure that you won't do more of the same? No, they just gave the IMF the money, and we'll figure the rest out later. So they should at least act like the IMF when dealing with the IMF.
Well, I mean, what you just said reminded me of what you sort of call the T-shirt problem, which is there that kind of rage that FDR had on the left as opposed to the right? I mean, when this crisis first happened last September, you weren't really sure what the long-term political consequences would be. You were hopeful that massive government spending on the bailout and the stimulus package would lead people to say, hey, if they can spend money on that, why not on healthcare? Why not on green infrastructure? But then you, being somewhat pessimistic, you thought, well, probably once the crisis is over, we'll just return to business as usual. And I was wondering what you thought now, 6 months later.
Well, I think if we look at it internationally, we do see a contrast between specifically what the lack of mobilization in this country, which is quite striking considering the scale of the bank bailout. You know, much smaller bank bailouts in European countries have led to these huge protests where people are questioning the priorities. Why are you cutting back education when you have all this money to bail out the banks? And it's forcing governments to change course. I mean, I think it's really striking that Sarkozy, who, less than a year ago was advertising himself as France's Margaret Thatcher, right, comes to the G20 summit, and because he's facing so much pressure from below in his country, says, unless we re-regulate the financial sector, I'm walking away. Now, that turned out to be a bluff, but there has been a real shift, and I think he shows, and so does Angela Merkel, who also started off much further to the right and has moved to the center in the face of this pressure. So I think we are talking about a particularly American phenomenon that I think has a lot to do with the two-party system, has a lot to do with the concentration of corporate media, and this protectiveness around Obama, which I think is understandable. I mean, if you turn on Fox and you see this, incredibly angry rhetoric directed at the first African-American president, it does bring out a protectiveness in you. But I just think that we have to recognize that that is demobilizing. So, my fear is not that we will return to the status quo. I don't think that's possible, and everything that I've spent a lot of time studying crises, and including economic crises like the Asian economic crisis, the peso crisis, Argentina's economic collapse in 2001. We talk about bailouts, and I think it's really an apt phrase. If we think about our economy as a ship, there is a bailout that's going on, but it isn't water that's being thrown off the ship. It's people. It's jobs. It's homes. And even to this day, Asia hasn't recovered the level of employment that it lost in the Asian financial crisis in 1997, when 24 million people were thrown out of work. So this, even if the bailout works, even if the economy stabilizes, it comes at an incredible human cost if this thinking isn't challenged. So the society that you return to at the end of this is this leaner, meaner society. And even if you think about it, the microcosm of the mentality of how the auto companies are being restructured. For some reason, after an election campaign that was all about protecting workers and protecting blue-collar jobs, and the candidate who was promising to protect good union jobs won, we're not challenging the logic that there should just be layoffs, downsizing. So that's just one example that I think we are going to have fewer good jobs. There's going to be a larger underclass. And leaner, meaner means meaner. Because when you have a hugely unequal society, it does become more militarized. You do need to develop more rationales to explain enormous inequality. And so what I worry about is that what we're seeing is an adjustment, that this crisis will leave us with an adjustment, and we end up with a society that looks more like Brazil. Or India. Sometimes I don't like to say this, but I think maybe Thomas Friedman is right. And the world is kind of flat, and we are sort of settling into this this society of huge winners, huge losers, which is actually the norm in most parts of the world.
But in terms of political mobilization, do you think that will be simply accepted, or do you think there will be any?
So that was the bleak part.
Protest.
No, I mean. That's my fear, and that is, I think, where we end up if we don't challenge this logic. The reason why I am not hopeless by any means is that I think that something really significant has happened in the midst of this crisis, which is the spell of Reaganomics has been broken. Which is, Paul Krugman called it the can't-do government. He coined that phrase during Hurricane Katrina, the government that can't do anything. But, everybody under 45 has grown up with the relentless message that that whatever your problem is, don't look to any kind of collective solution. And I think the very fact of seeing the incredible amounts of energy and resources that have been mobilized to bail out the banks has broken this spell for a generation of young people who won't easily ever again accept the idea that that collective solutions are impossible. And I think particularly when it comes to climate change, where there is so much of a rightful sense of urgency. And the other flip side of that is that the failure of the markets so spectacularly in this moment has also challenged the sort of accepted wisdom pre-crisis that climate change would be solved through market-based solutions. That there was a problem, but we were going to leave it to the market. I think, once again, that this generation is much less inclined to accept either that the government can't do anything, that we can't do anything together, or that we should leave our most pressing problems to the market. So I think we are going to see a shift. And I think that the experience of winning this election for all of those young people who got involved, with any luck, it won't lead to a sort of, okay, we tried politics, we didn't get the change, so we're all going to go home. I don't think that, the young people I'm meeting, and I do a lot of speaking on college campuses, are not taking that tact. They got a little taste of victory, and that can be addictive, which is great. So I do think we are going to see a shift, maybe in about a year's time when the sort of glow wears off.
We've just got about a minute left. Briefly, you've written recently that you thought that people responsible for the crisis should be investigated and possibly criminally prosecuted, and it's evident that that's not Obama's inclination. Why do you think he's wrong about that?
Well, I think it's not just that he said this about the people who created the economic crisis. This has been the sort of mantra of looking forward, not looking back, whether it comes to torture or any of the crimes of the Bush years. And maybe that is the role of the president. Maybe the president needs to be focused on the future, not looking back. But I think for everybody else, including Congress, it's absolutely crucial that there be real accountability, real hearings. And not just because of deterrence. I think it has to do with how societies mature. And in my sort of study of what happens to us when we're in a crisis, when we're in a state of shock, what that means is that we've lost our collective narrative. Mm-hmm. And I've also looked at those societies that don't regress, don't panic when there is a crisis. And what I found in each case is that the countries that are most resistant to shock and manipulation in periods of crisis are countries that have a deep sense of collective history, that have a narrative, including the bad, not just the sort of happy version of history.
Excuse me.
We're out of time. History matters. Thank you, Larissa.